The Deadzone Containment Protocols from Mantic Games.
Need to Know by Jake Thornton, adapted by Greg D. Smith. Controlling an empire of 100,000 worlds is no different from controlling a single country. Control the knowledge, and you control the people. Everything else is just scale. Attributed to the prax known as the philosopher. The elevator doors parted with the barest hiss, and Radchik stepped out onto the gloss-black tiles of the atrium, rubber-soled shoes making barely a whisper of a sound as he headed for his desk. Around him the lights were already on, throwing out their soft glow. There was no natural light. Windows were just too much of a risk, no matter how armored, and so he lived out his working days bathed in artificial illumination, which was set to reflect seasonal and hourly changes. He reached the neodymium blast-proof desk and sat down, laying his briefcase beside him. His terminal was flashing already, incoming messages indicated by the insistent steady wink of the amber light. There were also several written reports in a neat pile off to one side, the meticulous copperplate writing as familiar to him as his own script. The old man had clearly been here early, or else had not left at all the previous day. Certainly his light had still been on when Radchik had left. The old man, he smiled to himself at the thought as he powered up the terminal. It was difficult for him to think of the man he worked for as anything else. His medium height, slate paunch, and balding pate combined to give him an initial impression of an avicular figure, until you looked at the eyes. 5 years previously, stood in that cavernous office with its collection of art, its antiqued polished wood furniture, and its deep piled carpet, Radchik had stared into those eyes for the very first time. He had held the gaze, remembering the advice he had always been given by his therapist about how to appear strong and confident. Those eyes, dark and completely emotionless, had just stared right back at him, through him even. They had held the gaze for over a minute before the man had looked back to the form before him, speaking the first words that Radchik had ever heard from him.
It's Radchik, is it?
To this day, he was convinced that it had been his holding that terrible stare that had netted him the job. That the counselor chose to employ human aid at all was just another one of his eccentricities, as much as the antiques and the carpet. Charged with the terrible burden of responsibility for untold billions of lives, each of the council dealt with that pressure in their own way. The old man had the same access his fellows did to the very latest and most sophisticated technology to discharge his duties, AI supercomputers, androids, and the like. But he preferred the personal touch that only a living, pure-strained human could bring. Not that they were close. In 5 years, Radchik couldn't recall a single personal conversation with his employer. They talked often, of course. That was part of the job, as he reeled off relevant news, production figures, security notifications, and the like, at regular briefings. He knew, too, the counselor's habits. The way he liked to drink green leaf tea, in the old Terran custom, with 2 lumps of pure sugar, and always ensuring that bovine milk had been added to the cup first. In many ways, it would have been easy for Radchik to forget just who he worked for, and what that meant. But there were reminders. Amongst them, the auspiciously solid desk he sat behind, and the lack of any natural light. It was an odd existence, to be sure. He felt a certain amount of loyalty to the old man, and a great deal of pride in his job. But he often wondered, if he dropped down dead, whether he would be missed at all. The old man had always been good to him, generous pay, and a sense that he would always be looked after. But when you saw, as Radchik did, the numbers of human and alien lives that hung on every decision the counselor made, it was difficult to feel as if one was in any way significant. His screen powered on. He accessed his messages and began scrolling down through them with the ease of practice. An AI would simply reroute all but the most top-secret messages to the relevant departments, bothering the counselor with only the most highly sensitive matters. Radchik approached things differently. There were matters that the old man would wish to have personal sight of that were objectively of very little importance. Responsible for a large part of the Fifth Sphere, that wild frontier at the very edge of GCPS expansion, the old man liked to keep abreast of certain types of project and certain figures within particular corporations. In his privileged position, Radchik had grown to be able to recognize exactly the sorts of news that the counselor would wish to personally scrutinize, and precisely the nature of matters that he would wish to take personal involvement in. It was not a fixed pattern, nor any kind of set rules that could be programmed to an algorithm. It was simply a matter of feel, and precisely why the old man preferred to have a human aid in the first place. Endless messages scrolled up the screen, and he flicked through each one, speed reading the headlines before assigning the file and moving on. Within an hour, he had pulled 6 files out of the 200 that he had determined would be of interest, including an apparently minor rebellion on Dentral 4 and a trade embargo currently in force on the Snaven sector. He hit print, and the machine in the corner came to life, sheaves of paper spilling forth. Taking up the pile of paper files left on his desk, he now began reading through the tiny script, tapping out notes on his keypad as he went. It was all fairly standard stuff. The grant of an exclusive trade warrant to the Senshig Corporation in a newly opened system, an execution order for a dozen dissidents of the rebellion for acts of theft and piracy. Nothing out of the ordinary at all. He was just finishing dealing with these when the buzzer at his desk went off. The noise caused him to jump, unaccustomed as it was. In the last 5 years, Ratchet could count on one hand the number of times that buzzer had sounded. His was a solitary life. The old man was mostly the only other human that he actually ever saw, let alone spoke to, and ensconced here, in his private offices, visitors were rare. He tapped the intercom switch and spoke into the mic.
Hello? This is Conciliary Aide Radchik. How may I be of assistance to you?
There was a moment of silence, almost as if the person at the other end hadn't understood or hadn't heard him. He was about to try again when they finally spoke.
I have an urgent priority 1 message for the counselor. I must see him.
The voice was clipped, the tone neutral and precise. Ratchik paused. This was most bizarre. As a counselary aide, he had one of the highest security clearances in the galaxy, second only to the counselor and a handful of military commanders. He was baffled as to what sort of message the old man could be receiving that wasn't able to be sent through the normal secure channels, and therefore to his desktop. He was about to question this when something quite astonishing happened. The line went dead, and the security panel on his desk indicated that the private elevator had been summoned. Only he and the old man had the necessary physical triple encrypt key for the front door, let alone the fact that both door and elevator were keyed to their own personal biometrics. He sat frozen for several seconds, wondering what to do. He didn't want to bother the old man until he was sure of what was happening. But on the other hand, what if this were an attack of some kind? He had been drilled, of course, and the simple act of hitting the red panic button under his desk would put the whole building on lockdown and summon a whole platoon of enforcers in less than a minute. On the other hand, the voice had not sounded threatening, and clearly they had the appropriate security protocols. If he summoned the enforcers, they would be shooting first and asking absolutely no questions beyond, "Is it dead?" The soft ping of the elevator arriving and the slight hiss of the door opening cut him short in his rambling thoughts, and he looked up to see a new arrival. It was a woman dressed in a plain dark suit. No ID badge or rank insignia were visible, and her face was emotionless in a way that was quite disturbing. It was the closest visual approximation to utter ambivalence that Radchik had ever seen, as if absolutely nothing that those eyes could see would offer even the barest hint of surprise, and the eyes themselves, without even the barest hint of life. He had only seen one other pair of eyes like that, and they belonged to the man in the chamber behind him. For the briefest, most absurd moment, he wondered if he was in the presence of a second counselor. Recovering himself, he stood and extended a hand in formal greeting.
I am Conciliary Aide
Radchik,
She cut across him smoothly.
personal liaison to the counselor for the last 5 years, 3 months, 2 weeks, and 1 day. You are 37 standard years old, you live alone, and have no living family members.
Radchik stood, open-mouthed. Even used to the power of his employer, he was shocked at how much this stranger seemed to know about him.
Time is of the essence, Radchik. I must speak with the counselor now.
Whatever message you have, ma'am,
He finished lamely, as she left the pause entirely devoid of her name.
I assure you that I am able to deliver it personally to the
Time is of the essence, Radchik. Additional, the contents of the message are strictly eyes only for the counselor. This is priority 1.
I think you will find that.
Time is of the essence. Is the counselor present?
He was starting to get flustered. She couldn't even let him finish a sentence, and now she was just demanding to be let through.
Now listen, ma'am. The counselor is very busy.
I will see him now.
With that, she strolled past him, up to the door of the old man's private chamber. He stood smug for a second, waiting for the door to reject her. Instead, she held up her right hand, and a scanner read it. Next, she leaned forward and allowed another scanner to take a reading from her eye. The devices retracted, and the door locks disengaged with a thump, a heavy neodymium door swinging inwards. Without a backward glance at Radchik, the woman stepped through the door, and it promptly shut behind her. Radchik walked up to it, intending to enter behind her and apologize to the counselor for the interruption, but found the door shut tight. It was keyed to respond to his biometrics via the door handle, giving him ease of access to the counselor rather than having to offer full security scans every time he had to enter, but now it was locked tight. After a couple of unsuccessful attempts at moving it, he went back to his desk and activated the security cam viewer for the private chamber. A static fuzz came back at him, hissing quietly from the screen. Radchik slumped into his chair, absolutely at a loss as to what he could do. 10 minutes later, the door opened again, and the woman strode past him to the elevator, boarding it and leaving without another word. He noted that the static had cleared, and the security viewer showed him the old man sat at his desk, head in his hands. That was a bad sign. He quickly prepared a cup of green leaf tea and took it over the threshold, placing it on the old man's desk, and then standing back with a polite cough. The old man seemed to start, as if the cough had woken him from some dream. He stared at Radchik for a few moments, in a way that left Radchik feeling utterly unmanned. In those eyes that he had known and respected these last 5 years, he saw an emotion that baffled him. Fear. The moment passed, and the old man seemed to grow again as he recovered his composure. The eyes returned to their accustomed fixed stare, and he looked straight at his aide.
Well, Radchik, what can I do for you?
Radchik paused for a second as he gathered his thoughts, but in truth, he knew he had to ask.
Who exactly was that woman, sir?
Woman? You mean the drone? An android, Radchik, a messenger from the 8th Directorate.
Radchik flinched as if he had been struck. 8th Directorate was a legend used to scare children into behaving, a shadowy organization that was half myth even in the rarefied circles of the council itself. He felt a physical chill at the thought of having been in the same room as one. He realized that the old man was talking to him.
Radchik, you with me here?
Yes, sir. Sorry. May I ask, sir, what was it here for?
The old man pinched the bridge of his nose and breathed out a heavy sigh.
Bad business, Radchik. Bad business indeed. Can't give you any details.
I see, sir. Well, will that be all?
Just one more thing.
The counselor scribbled a quick note and passed it across the desk to Radchik.
See that the message gets sent to Commander Vartok immediately. Priority 1.
Radchik looked at the slip of paper. On it were some galactic coordinates and 2 solitary words, Containment Protocol. It wasn't a command that he was familiar with, but the manner of the old man told him not to inquire further. He did have one more question, though.
Sir, can I give the commander a specific destination at all? These coordinates seem quite vague.
The old man looked up at him with those piercing gray eyes.
Nexus Psi.